Okay, joining us now on the debate in Dayton, Ohio, Colonel Kathy Platoni, clinical psychologist with the U.S. Army Reserve. And back here in studio, Brian Stewart, senior fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs and, of course, former foreign correspondent at CBC Television. Rafal Rohazinski, principal at the SecDev Group, that's an Ottawa-based security and development consultancy. And Paul Mitchell, deputy director of academics at the Canadian Forces College here in Toronto. Colonel Platoni, Kathy, as you've given me permission to call you, it's good to have you on the line from Ohio, and you three gentlemen here in the studio, nice to have you here as well. Here, Steve. I want to start by reading an excerpt from Ian Bremmer, who writes about this stuff in Foreign Affairs magazine, then we'll come back and talk. War in the time of instant messaging is what he's calling this. Information technology has demolished time and distance. Walter Wriston, the former CEO of what is now Citigroup, wrote in 1997. Instead of validating Orwell's vision of Big Brother watching the citizen, it enables the citizen to watch Big Brother. And so the virus of freedom, for which there is no antidote, is spread by electronic networks to the four corners of the earth. Brian, to you first. I guess the days of Ernie Pyle are over. Can governments and the military still control information during a time of war?
Control's a harsh word. Military and the media are like a bad marriage. They stick together in war for the sake of the kids, but they have to get along. Control is not the word I would use, but certainly manipulate, and the use of strategic communications is something the military is constantly on the lookout for. Ways in which to get across the narrative, the themes of the war, ways to bring home to the home audience and to the public of the local country themes and images it wants them to see, but also to hide images it doesn't want them to see.
Rafal, how would you answer?
Well, I'd answer it slightly differently. I mean, part of the problem is that we're now seeing the generation who fights the wars being digital natives. These are people who grew up with, immersed in the information environment. For them, bringing a BlackBerry to the front line of combat, as happened with the IDF in Israel and in the Hezbollah war, is almost natural. They're being led by a generation of commanders who are digital natives.
Does this really happen a lot? Soldiers bring BlackBerries and iPhones?
During the Israel-Hezbollah war, that was one of the reasons why the Israelis had such trouble in South Lebanon. It's because Hezbollah was effectively listening in on conversations that soldiers were having back and forth and being able to locate units, find out where casualties being taken, and then turn that into a strategic communications product themselves, which they spoke back to the Israeli public, therefore getting the initiative in the information war.
Kathy, how would you answer the question?
Well, there's an upside and a downside to this. Being able to have constant communication with family members to put their minds at ease, or not, as the case may be, is a real gift to the soldier. And to have that support available to them on an ongoing basis. On the other hand, there is so much risk of Operation Security or OPSEC being violated with instantaneous information being communicated back home, which is often leverage for a tremendous amount of fear and violations of all sorts of security measures that are in place to protect soldiers from the enemy. So it can be a wonderful thing, and yet there are dangers inherent in way too much information getting out, and in communication blackouts being violated continuously.
Paul, let me get you to follow up on, and maybe control is too strong a word, but is it still possible for the military and governments to, if not control the message and control the media during times of war, then massage it to a point where they've really got a pretty good manipulative influence on things?
Well, the way that I would address the question is the difficulty that the institution has is that the culture itself is organized around the issue of control. Information is so vital to operational advantages, the type of operational security that Kathy was talking about, that you have to control that information to a great degree, not just in terms of preventing it from getting out, but to make sure that it is actually accurate. And that requires an enormous amount of information assurance on military networks.
But you use the word control. Can you control?
You can control what's on your own network, but you cannot. I would agree with everybody here that there is a real difficulty in controlling the message that emanates outside of those networks.
Brian, if people go to our website, they're going to see a guest blog that you wrote for us, and in that you mentioned the phrase strategic communication. What's that a reference to?
That really is the new attempt since Iraq and through Afghanistan of the military at the top levels and politicians at the top level to really I keep coming back to control, but it's a different kind of manipulate the message as much as possible to sell the mission, sell the war.
Manipulate has a very pejorative tone
let me
to
give
it,
you
though.
a couple of examples. Let me ask one question. When have we seen dead Taliban in Afghanistan on our television screens? I would say to you we have never seen, in Canada's role, time in Afghanistan, images of dead bodies. Rarely in Iraq would you see dead bodies of insurgents in Iraq.
Why
And the
is that?
reason for that is the military doesn't want them to be seen for reasons that were made very evident in the Gulf War. On the highway of death, one of the shocks to the whole coalition were the scenes of these dead, burnt, horribly burnt.
We've got shots of this. Viewer discretion advised here, but we do have shots about what Brian's talking about, and I think you're right. I can't remember the last time we saw dead Taliban on television.
The world was so shocked by these images. They were so horrific, and they shocked more than the home audience, which said, this is the ugliness of war we don't want any part of. But they shocked the coalition America was then leading, and that put extra pressure on Bush to call off the invasion, the attack into Kuwait.
This is Bush the father.
Bush the father after 100 hours. And that lesson was learned very carefully by the military, that the days of being able to show dead bodies without consequences are now over. In Afghanistan, if Taliban dead are shown, that will be shown around, let us say, the Islamic world with considerable political risk involved.
Rafal, you buying this?
But I think, Brian, actually you make the point here that it's both a generational change, because if you take a look at where most Canadians now are starting to get their news, it's shifting from the official media to the blogs, to the sort of darker crevices of cyberspace, and there you will see those crevices awash with images of dead bodies from Iraq and Afghanistan. And in fact, the networking of messaging is avoiding or circumventing, outmaneuvering strategic communication by using peer-to-peer, community-based communication, sort of social networking 2.0 in order to spread the news, in order to create the images. And that's something which I think our military leaders are having a tremendous difficulty dealing with.
Oh, I don't disagree at all that there are ways that are being got around there. We have, as was mentioned earlier, the terrorist groups now have their own strategic communications. I mean, the Taliban used to be completely against the media. Now they've set up their own media operation. They go on blogs as much as they can. They send out videos, YouTube, you name it, they're filming all the time. So there are ways to get around it. But that is, I think, even more than anything, increased the pressure from the military to try and control the image as much as possible, because the risks out there are so grave to them.
Kathy, how important has it been, would you say, to the U.S. military to make sure those images that we just saw don't end up on television screens across America?
Absolutely critical. These are very inflammatory images, and yet soldiers bring them home and share them widely with family and friends and on Facebook. So they are out there. That peer-to-peer social network that you mentioned is alive and well.
Should we be seeing these things, Paul?
Yeah, I think actually it's been a mistake not to show the images on TV. It brings home exactly what the conflict is about in some ways. It engages the public in ways that I think cause them to reflect critically on the mission, and to ask themselves whether or not the types of sacrifices that are being asked of Canadian soldiers or soldiers around the world are in fact worth the cost.
Kathy, do you know if the U.S. government has ever tried to ask Google or YouTube, for example, to block any of these images that, that people may have tried to upload independent of any news organization or anything like that?
I am not aware of that. It certainly sounds like a good idea, though, but I have no idea if that has been undertaken.
Brian?
It goes beyond the images. The images are the main thing that's really striking. When you see something like the shock and awe of the bombing of Baghdad, you think a whole new revolutionary war is upon us. Very quickly you find out that war is war is war, and war goes back to a lot of its basic roots. But as you take away images of the dead, you also are taking away the counting of the dead. No Canadian, as far as I've been able to find out, has any idea how many Taliban, how many Afghans have been killed by Canadian soldiers in Afghanistan.
Why don't we know that?
We don't know that because the Army doesn't want to release the figures. They keep saying we're not going to get into the Vietnam era body count period. But how do we as a country really know the tempo of war if we don't know how many are getting killed? In Kandahar, the base where the Canadians are, We don't show video of rockets landing, smashing into them, because they're not supposed to be shown. So we don't have a lot of the aspects of that war that we know about as society, and I think that's one of the reasons as a society we don't take all that much interest in the war.
Paul?
There's a real interest in keeping this war as sterile as possible. To shield the public from the realities of war because of the implications of collapse of support that Kathy referred to earlier about the reaction to the images of the so-called highway of death. But I think it's fundamentally incorrect to shield the public from the notion that war is in fact a dirty, ugly business. Because in keeping those things away from us, we begin to believe that this can be done on the cheap and easy. This can be done with minimal sacrifice, that we can go into countries and have our way with them with relatively few consequences.
Well, one of the things we do know around this literal and metaphorical table is that there is one organization that does not share your view on leaking, and that's WikiLeaks. They very much want that information out there, and as you know, they have they've done one of the most massive information dumps in the last little while, the biggest leak of classified information in U.S. history. Let's bring up this graphic. 391,832 individual reports detailing more than 100,000 deaths in Iraq, and it broke them down. 66,000 civilian deaths. We knew none of this until WikiLeaks came along. 66,000 civilian deaths, 23,000 more than enemy insurgent casualties, more than 15,000 Iraqi government forces killed, and more than 3,000 friendly coalition forces killed as well. This according to the Christian Science Monitor. Paul, let me follow up with you. Have the WikiLeaks files become, for this generation, what the Pentagon Papers were to the previous generation in Vietnam?
I think there's a real problem in equating WikiLeaks with the Pentagon Papers. First off, the Pentagon Papers was a study that was commissioned by the Pentagon, Daniel Ellsberg being the principal researcher on that. When his findings were more or less hushed up within the bureaucracy of the Pentagon itself, that was when he decided that he was going to release that study publicly and leak it to the press. In WikiLeaks, what seems to have happened is a number of relatively low-level individuals with access to America's classified networks have done a data dump in many regards with the number of documents that have been released. Much of the documents that have been released have been very tactical, and therefore the type of revelations that have come out of them, really, I mean, the types of casualties that you just listed have been listed by other organizations as well, some higher, some lower. It really doesn't have the same sort of resonance as the Pentagon Papers, which revealed real government cover-ups in terms of how the war was being prosecuted.
Rafal.
I keep coming back to this as if I was the 20-year-old sitting with my octogenarian friends, but WikiLeaks is I think to the mass media a bit of a shock because it came out in bulk. It was nicely packaged. It was friendly for big media to report on it. But let's not forget, groups like Iraq Body Count have been putting out these statistics for years on a rolling count on casualties. Let's not forget that the U.S. military, as well as its Iraqi forces in Iraq, have been interoperating with civilian agencies for years as well that have basically put this out as public information ever since the beginning of the war in 2003. That information has circulated among, again, social networks, and it's been quite well known. So I think we tend to focus on what the media impact is without necessarily recognizing the fact that at an operational level, among the communities that matter, this has been well-known information for years and one which has been acted upon by groups of care.
I do want to get a better understanding of the impact on the troops, though. And Kathy, I think you're just back from Afghanistan, aren't you? When were you last there?
Just last week. We actually left Afghanistan around the 19th of October and arrived back in the States on the 23rd.
Okay, so tell me this. Transparency is a wonderful thing, but how do the troops react when they find out this information as well?
Depending on where you are located in Afghanistan, you're in a real information glut. We often find that we're making the news rather than hearing the news because in the more remote areas, there is no availability of this information. The internet is sporadic, bandwidth is very low, so oftentimes this information is something that we only hear about when we come home. On some of the larger installations or forward operating bases, that information is readily available, but with the numbers of hours worked and the number of missions, again, there's not all that much time to attend to this kind of information. So your mission focus is something that eclipses everything else. So oftentimes we miss all of this information. It's just not as available to us for time constraint reasons alone.
Let me follow up with Brian on that. You've covered a lot of war. What was your impression about how much the average soldier knew or didn't know about what was really going on?
Oh, and almost invariably, I would agree with that. Almost invariably, it's the mission itself that takes up the interest. In Kandahar base, soldiers can go out of their barracks or tents and go into the mess at 2:30 in the morning, get a big breakfast, and be watching live television of hockey games coming in from Canada or live news. One gets a sense, though, when you're there, they're not that interested in what's coming out from the home. They're so much wrapped up in the year they're facing there that tends to be everything. Also, not just in the mission, but in the small group of friends, the camaraderie of the platoon they're particularly with, for instance.
Sure. Paul, you wanted to follow?
I was just going to comment on the WikiLeaks again. I think what really this case indicates to a certain degree is the level of overclassification that is going on. That there wasn't really enormous surprises that were coming out of the documents that were revealed. Suggests that a lot of the information probably shouldn't have been classified in the first place.
And it was classified because?
It's because really the interest in controlling that information as tightly as possible. And so the safest thing for somebody who has a discrete information is to classify it secret at the first level. I've been told by people in Washington that unless it has a secret stamp on it, it's not going to be taken seriously. And so there's enormous amounts of information that is classified on these networks that probably shouldn't be classified in the first place.
Brian, then Rafal.
I think at one point, one has to realize there's a difference about the war in both Iraq and Afghanistan from looking back at Korea or the Second World War, First World War, and that these are insurgencies and counterinsurgencies. And the basic drive of the insurgents is to use shock video as much as possible, get as much out there. But the basic concern of the counterinsurgents is to hide those as much as possible. You do not win hearts and minds, for instance, by putting out a lot of pictures of people dead in the host country. So as long as there's a counterinsurgency war, I think there will be this intense effort to hide a lot of this material or keep it under wraps. That would be perhaps different if it was two nations going at it.
Rafal.
Yeah, although I think I'd get back to the fact that there's a growing realization within the military especially that you can't do that. That there's a core of information that pertains to operations, ongoing operations, where really you don't want to put troops at risk, and that's the reason why you want to make sure that's unavailable. But you can't hide something like Abu Ghraib. You can't even hide what goes on in a platoon that happens to have both a component of a PRT, civilians around, or even an Afghan carrying a cell phone who's illiterate. So I think there's a recognition that the information environment is not something that you can containerize in quite the way that's
They say that after an event. I often wonder, though, what about the next one that comes along, whether it's to do with injured soldiers not being treated properly, whether it's to do with detainees. I mean, yes, they always tend to learn their lesson after the event, but as time moves on, new officers come in, new changes of command, changes the whole dynamic of a mission.
I think the problem here in looking at both these opinions here is that the military believes still strongly in the need to keep that information containerized, as you put it, to keep control of it, but there's no way in the modern technological environment. You talked about cell phones, video cameras, the little tiny digital cameras being brought into the field, people commenting on things in emails back to the family, the soldier blogs that have been discussed already, Facebook, what have you. All of these things mean that controlled military environment is bleeding over the civilian environment. The two networks are bleeding over into each other and influencing both each other. And that's, I think, the real tension that the military is struggling to cope with, is it's coming from a tradition where it has been able to control all the information emerging from a battle space to one where certain amounts of information, because of the planning information, operational information, certainly is stuff that is very closely held. But even there's material that is bleeding over between both sides.
Let me introduce a new element into our discussion here, and to do that, I'm going to ask our director, Michael Smith, to cue up this tape. This is a clip from a movie called The Messenger. You recognize Woody Harrelson, he's the actor in the movie, and this is about the Casualty Notification Team. Michael, roll the tape, please.
You know what I think? I think they ought to show every goddamn funeral on TV live. Have the president come around from time to time and eulogize vice president. Get people used to it. I mean, we at war or not.
Kathy, if you would, take us back a bit, because we know when, for example, George W. Bush was president, the shots of the bodies coming back or the caskets coming back, that was not allowed. How come?
I think because the Army had a vested interest in not allowing the general public to realize the toll of war. I don't understand the thought process behind that, because I think we have every reason to appreciate the sacrifices and the toll exacted from military service, voluntary military service. In fact, I have no idea what the underlying reason was, only that that was the rule of law at the time. I believe since we were in Afghanistan that has changed, and we are allowed to film caskets coming back. I know our ramp ceremonies are not filmed, but our memorial services are often filmed. So the mindset escapes me. I would love to know.
Well, I think most of us remember well, President Obama, almost immediately after taking over, one of the first things he did was go down to, I think it was Dover, and salute those caskets coming back, and they put it on television. He wanted people to see. Brian, we've gone the exact opposite way in Canada. We've got the Highway of Heroes here.
We did, and Canada showed really from the very beginning, a great deal of respect for bringing the dead home. The coffins, the flag-draped coffins, the ceremonies, the ramp ceremonies, and also ceremonies when they arrived in Canada. It's as if we sanitized the war, that term was used earlier, sanitized the war so that we would show only really the losses through the coffins, the contained ceremonies of coffins. Crews do not, for instance, in Afghanistan, shoot badly injured Canadians in the field while they're getting first aid. They are not supposed to shoot badly wounded Canadians on the way to hospital. Again, we don't shoot the Taliban dead or the Taliban wounded. So really we have reduced war now to a level it probably was seen at in the First World War, where they saw virtually nothing except honored ceremonies for the dead. And I think this does sanitize the war to a degree that makes it very unrealistic.
Rafal, I do have to say, I mean, I'm sure many of us have seen these ceremonies where, you know, people are waiting on the bridges to pay their respects, and the caskets come along the Highway of Heroes. It's one of the most moving things I've ever seen in my life. But is Brian right? Does it sanitize, and this is not a real word, but over-patriotize war to the exclusion of our knowing maybe some of the gruesome side that we ought to know?
Well, I think, you know, it's something which fits within the theater of war that we've created in terms of mass culture, and certainly in the way that it's presented through the mass media. But again, I'll come back to it. You know, the families of those who perish in Afghanistan network. There's a fairly, you know, solid grassroots movements around veterans.
So what are they seeing or knowing that we aren't?
Well, they see the images that are taken by small digital cameras. They hear the emotions that are raw, that aren't just flag-draped emotions. These things are a groundswell, and I'd say that, you know, we have a tendency of focusing too much and overestimating perhaps too much the role of the mass media, and not seeing that the information revolution, the cyberspace, has really created the potential for grassroots movements which are equivalent to or greater than that which previously was really channeled through the mass media itself. And we take a look at Obama's election, Move On campaign. I mean, that was a grassroots campaign. Look at the success of the Tea Party, etc. I think you see the same kind of groundswell building around issues like Afghanistan as well. It's just that it's just below the surface of where the mass media touches it.
Right. But isn't this like saying in the First World War you could hand out pamphlets or you could put out leaflets for people to read? The reality is most Canadians do get their news through mass media, their views of Afghanistan through mass media. And the fact that this is sanitized or controlled, and by the way, I have nothing but the highest respect for the whole Highway of Heroes ceremony. I think it's remarkable. But the fact that it's at the government level that it is affected, massaged, manipulated, that we do have to be concerned. Yes, images will get out, but that's not exactly the best way for information to flow.
Just in responding to Rafal too, I think it's been interesting that that government policies in Canada and the United States, I believe, has been largely about protecting families from the images of these, that they don't want to see their loved ones dead on the screen. And so even though, as you say, images are circulating around Satovachi and on on the internet and such. At the same time, it's the government saying, no, we don't want this out on the mass media.
I think it's also important to note, I mean, I don't want to say that anybody sees an image suddenly becomes anti-war. I think that's not the point. The point I was trying to make, though, is that the debate around what it means to families and individuals, I think, is much more informed than just through the mass media, and it's helped by this social networking 2.0.
Well, let me get Kathy on that, too. Can you tell us, in your experience dealing with families who have been affected and associated with the war, what their view is on these repatriation ceremonies and whether coffins ought to or ought not to be seen coming back into America from points beyond?
Of all of the family members that I've spoken to, they are tremendously in support of showing these coffins and paying tribute. And I think that's our finest hour, when we can honor the lives that have been lost and have a highway of heroes and the Patriot Guard lined up along the highway with flags of Canada or the United States. I think most of them feel that that's entirely appropriate and is not shown enough.
Brian, you've covered wars over a long period of time. Was there a change in what you were allowed to show, if that's the right word, say when you started, as compared to, say, last time you went to Afghanistan?
Well, no, and more a change of what the crews were able to get out of the field. I've never felt myself terribly restricted, but I do feel all our images from Afghanistan and now from Iraq are much more restricted than they would have been, say, the Falklands War, where in every war you can think of, you can see the turning point where images of badly injured, dead soldiers starts to change. In Vietnam, it was the Hue, the Battle of Hue. The Marines stacked upon the tanks, horrifying images. The dead bodies, My Lai massacre, of course. The Falklands War, when the British ship carrier was hit and the bodies were dragged ashore. The Gulf War, the burnt Iraqi. So one after the other, you get to these points where the violent images really strike home. And right now, I just see a very strong effort to keep those violent images at bay in the very same way they were kept at bay during the First World War. As to the dead, remember that Wilfred Owen and the great poems of the First World War were very upset frequently at the way in which political patriotic fervor surrounded the dead. Pro Patria More, you know. Yes. He wrote moving poems that we have now simplified death and elevated to an angelic moment, and that it's taking the public's attitude away from the real suffering of the troops in the trenches and the terribly wounded.
Let's show one more clip from The Messenger, because this is going to raise another angle in what we're discussing here. So, Michael, one more time, from The Messenger.
Sergeant, one more thing. We make it our business to deliver the news within 24 hours of positive ID. The ideal is within 4. We're racing Fox, CNN, Drudge Report, what have you. Not to mention any soldier with a cell phone or webcam. Whole point is we got to be first. So if you're in bed or church or the ballet, this baby stays on.
Kathy, how accurate is that scenario where families are going to learn about losses through Fox TV rather than from the military themselves?
Probably pretty accurate. I think a lot of family members rely on the media to get the facts, because we are so restricted in the information that we can provide until we return home. And I think there is a real push for soldiers to tell their stories and for the horrors of war and the tremendous losses to be out there in the public so that people really understand what it is that we bring to that banquet table as soldiers.
Rafal, you're going to take us into the world rather, of social media here. Is it a fact that more people are finding out about these things through some other source as opposed to through official channels first?
Well, I'll give you one very real-life example, and again, going back to the Israeli-Hezbollah war. Israelis usually learned of casualties that the IDF was happening first from broadcasts from Hezbollah. And that's an interesting fact, because what it points to is that it's not just the media, it's not just social network 2.0, but it's actually our opponents in these battle spaces that recognize the first with the message gets the credibility with the home audience.
Okay, speaking of the home audience, let's focus. What are we down here? About 8 or 9 minutes left to go here. Let's talk about the attempts by the government and the military to control the message, but the soldiers want to get the message out first. And we've talked about how soldiers have a chance to, call home on video and that kind of thing. Kathy, Tell us, in your experience, what kind of access soldiers have overseas who are trying to call home, be it by video phone or BlackBerry or iPhones. How does all that work?
You know, in the current theater of operations in Afghanistan, we have internet cafes and internet access in our hooches or our barracks for all intents and purposes. So we have tremendous access to the internet. Of course, there's low bandwidth problems, so a lot of times it's very difficult to access the internet, but most people have a cell phone or a BlackBerry or some means of communication, and a lot of people call home on a daily basis. It's that available. This was not the case 5 years ago in Iraq, but things have improved markedly. One of the downsides of that is that families get information that they may not want to hear, that is cause for concern, cause for worry. It's often a battlefield, forgive the terminology, for husbands and wives or parents and children to fight publicly about issues that can't be resolved over the phone or over the internet. So you have the ugliness of hearing everybody's business publicly in an internet cafe, and then again you have people who find that just allowing their family members to know that they're safe and sound is a wonderful thing to put their minds at rest. However, that being said, when soldiers are out on mission and they don't have access to the internet or to their phones, families worry. A lot of times, attempts for communication blackouts when there are casualties, when there are wounded and dead, the internet is how that information gets transported way too quickly before official notification channels are in place and make the proper notification. So again, there's the upside and the downside.
Well, one of the other downsides I think I read in a previous interview you gave, Kathy, was somebody trying to call home over the internet. And guess what? Wife had cleaned out the bank account, left home, left the kids, left everything.
Boy, we are ripe with stories like that, finding pictures of husbands and wives at the local watering hole on Facebook with other people that aren't their spouses, literally bank accounts cleaned out, family members who have moved, left no forwarding address, cleaned out everything, used power of attorney to access anything and everything in their power, so that the soldier is left with nothing. And here, they can't focus on the mission when they know they've lost everything and their loved ones, or supposed loved ones, have taken off.
Indeed.
Again, it's a ripe field for a lot of damage being done, and again, that takes away from a person's ability to be able to perform the mission. It's a sad day when that becomes the entire focus of someone's life.
For sure. Rafal.
That's absolutely right. I mean, you know, I think that we tended in this discussion to talk about how the battlefield has been kept from us at home without recognizing that home is now part of the battlefield for many of our warfighters.
Brian, have you heard these kind of stories before?
Oh, well, in Kandahar, where the Canadians are, there's a lid put on communications as soon as there is a fatality to avoid information coming back. But definitely the stress of being in touch all the time. I mean, sometimes one perhaps is no more lonelier than the 5 minutes after you've just talked to the kids before they go to bed, and you're out there on a hill in Afghanistan. I think there's a level of emotional upheaval sometimes that very close communications can cause, as well as ease. There is one thing I would like to add on the question of the dad, because early on in the war, the General Hillier and the officers around him decided that the families were going to be absolutely critical for keeping support. And they devised a very strong, very elaborate system of support for families of anyone killed. Families are seen immediately. It's talked to them what kind of statement they may want to come out. They're helped with their statements they're going to make to the media. And one thing we've noticed throughout this entire war is time after time, the families always come out with really quite a supportive comment about the war.
They really do still. Even when they lose somebody, they still say that.
And the generals know this is vitally important to get the families on side in this way, and it's a major military effort to ensure that that happens.
Paul, take the last 30 seconds here and tell us whether you think technology has allowed a more unvarnished view of war to finally come home to us.
That's a really difficult question to answer, simply because in an environment like Afghanistan, it's a somewhat more austere than a place like Iraq. the level of coverage, I think, is more controllable there. It's difficult for the average Canadian to make sense of the conflict itself. There's no front lines, there's no advancement or falling back. And so even though we're awash in information, we have trouble making sense of what it all means.
Okay, let me thank all our guests for a great discussion on this, starting with Colonel Kathy Platoni in Dayton, Ohio. Kathy, we're so glad you could join us from your perch there as a member of the U.S. Army Reserve. Thanks so much for your participation today.
And thank you. This has been quite the honor.
For us, indeed. Rafael Rohozinski, and from the SecDef group, Paul Mitchell from Canadian Forces College here in Toronto. Thanks to you. And Brian Stewart, who, if I may say, has been a bit of a hero of mine for a long time. All those great years at CBC doing all that important coverage. Brian, great to have you on the program finally, too.
Great honor to be here.